that, our intrepid hero, Siddhartha Gautama, had left home at the age of 29 in search to an answer of his question, why is there suffering in the world? Or why do bad things happen to good people? Or what is the problem of evil? Different theologies have always been looking for answers to this same question, and this was his question. So he had cut his hair, changed clothes with a hunter, given away all of his royal jewels, and proceeded to live as a beggar and sleep under the trees. And everything was going along swimmingly until some people recognized him. Remember that his father, King Suddhodana, was a local politico, wealthy, maybe elected, possibly ancestral, we don't really know, but we're going to call him a king because that's what the traditional texts call him. And he was friends with another king named King Bimbisara. And King Bimbisara's men were out in the forest and they said, Siddhartha, aren't you Suddhodana's son? And the jig was up. So they invited him back to the palace. Actually, they sent a courier back to the palace, and King Bimbisara said, fetch him along. His dad's looking for him. So they bring him back to the palace, and Bimbisara asks Siddhartha, what are you doing? And he tries to explain what his quest is about and how he's on this spiritual search. And King Bimbisara says, go home, Siddhartha, go home. Your dad and mother are worried about you. But he says, I can't do that. And he explains his quest to King Bimbisara in such an impressive way that King Bimbisara says, you'd be a good king. I'm tired of being king. You want to take over my kingdom? And Siddhartha says, thank you, but no, I'm on this quest. You know, it keeps explaining this to people. So Bimbisara lets him go, and Siddhartha says to him, I will come back and teach you once I find the answer to my question. And we'll see later in his life, he does in fact return and teach King Bimbisara. Now Siddhartha decides to start looking for teachers. And one of his teachers was named Ananda Kalama. And he was in the Vedic tradition, pre-Hindu, obviously pre-Buddhist, there's no Buddha yet. And Siddhartha studied with him for a period of time. And the story goes that he learned everything Ananda Kalama had to teach him. And Ananda Kalama was so impressed, he said, I want you to be my lineage heir. I want you to take over for me when the time comes. And Siddhartha said, I can't do that. I have this quest. You're seeing the pattern here, right? He keeps having to explain this to people. Like, what part of quest? You gotta go. So he parts ways with Ananda. And another teacher that he had was a yoga teacher named Udrapa Rajapudra. And I find it interesting that Siddhartha learned yoga. It's very handy to have some kind of stretching and movement-based practice when you're sitting for long hours. So that makes perfect sense to me that he would have been a yogi. And he stayed longer this time. And once again, the legend says he mastered the teachings, and the teacher says, will you be my lineage heir? Will you take over for me? And what does Siddhartha say? I have this quest. So I can't stay, but thank you. He goes on to study with 4 other teachers for a total of 6 different individuals that he studied with. And at some point he realizes, I'm not finding the answer to my question. And so he stops studying with teachers. Now it's interesting to notice he didn't attain enlightenment, whatever that means, from studying with a specific teacher. But does the total of these 6 people's teachings have an impact on him? I dare say yes. Yeah, he probably would not have had that awakening experience that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes if he had not studied with these men. So, no teachers, he says, and he's going to try asceticism. So he hooks up with 5 of his old friends that he's known from back in the day, back in palace life, and they're all out now wandering as well. I mentioned that this was a fairly common thing, that as long as your family was provided for, it was okay if you left, if you were male, if you left and went out and sought the spiritual life. So he runs into his 5 friends, and they start competing with each other to try to push one another. And they're practicing these very strict ascetic rituals, regimens, who can eat the fewest grains of rice in a day type of thing. Siddhartha's practice got stricter and he started to get weaker. At one point, he was bathing in the river where people bathed, and an undertow swept him downstream and he nearly drowned. And after he crawled out of the river, he thought, this might not be the best plan. And he's sitting there, I can imagine him sitting there catching his breath, and he is flashing back on a memory from his childhood of sitting under a rose apple tree. And it was the first day of planting, and his father was there, and he was just very calm and at peace. And he's remembering that and thinking, that's what I'm looking for. And he's had these two extreme relationships with the world, where he's been a very pampered prince on the one end, and then he's been almost starving ascetic on the other end. And so he says, no, my path is in the middle. So there was a young girl named Sujata who lives in the village, and she had seen him nearly get swept along by the river. And then she saw him sitting under a tree. He decides he's going to go sit under a tree until he's either going to wake up or die. Okay, middle way. So I kind of wonder if these two stories didn't come at different times, written by different authors, right? Because they don't sound like they quite fit together. But regardless, so he goes and he finds a tree to sit under, and she sees him, and at first she mistakes him for a local god. This is the time when trees were gods, and rivers were gods, and naturally occurring springs were gods, small g, little deities, little local deities of the place, much like in Celtic Northern Europe. So she mistakes him for a god at first, but then realizes, no, that's not what he is. Then she recognizes him. Oh, you're the guy that nearly got swept away by the river. So she brings him some rice milk, and he accepts it. And this is the first time he's had anything resembling a real meal in who knows how long. And it's also the closest thing to mother's milk that she could give him. And this is an important turning point of him welcoming in feminine principles into his life. No more of this very almost militant, must succeed at any cost, but a gentler, softer approach. His 5 friends see this and they say, you traitor, you coward, we can't believe you're giving up like this. And they leave. And he says, that's fine. Sujata and her husband take him into their home, they nurse him back to health, and this is when he actually makes the decision, I'm going to sit under the tree or die. So he goes under what we now call the Bodhi tree, which means the awakening tree, right? Then came after the event, clearly. And supposedly the descendant of the original tree is still in Bodh Gaya, India, and you can go and sit under that Bodhi tree. These things live centuries, so who knows how old this tree is. So he decides he's going to sit there and he's going to wait and see what happens. So one of the first things that occurs to him is Mara appears. Well, you may remember Mara from the night that Siddhartha left home, and he says, go home, I'll make you a universal monarch in 7 days. Now Mara is deciding a different approach, and he says, basically, who do you think you are? That's my seat. I deserve that seat. Now realize, by the way, that Siddhartha has been traveling for 6 years during this period with the studying, with his different teachers and the asceticism. So a while has passed. Mara may have appeared, probably did appear in between then. But the Buddha knows that this is just part of his own mind, even if he doesn't have the Jungian language shadow self for it, he gets what's going on. Nonetheless, the story says he has a dialogue with the demon king Mara, and when Mara says, that's my seat, Siddhartha says, no, it's my seat. And Mara says, do you have by what right do you claim that seat? And Siddhartha says, by my right of all my lifetimes that I've been here as a bodhisattva, as a holy being, helping others. And Mara says, I can imagine this like a court of law. Who's your witness? Call your witness. I don't believe you. And the Buddha touches his fingers down to the earth and says, I call upon the earth as my witness. Now in the Vedic tradition, the earth was a feminine goddess. So once again, we have a touch of the feminine here in the life of the historical Buddha. And the earth goddess, earth mother, reaches up her fingers to touch his in acknowledgement that yes, he's been here before. and there's a small local earthquake like there was when he was born. So Mara's like, okay, I'm not going to get him by logic. What else have I got in my arsenal? So Siddhartha continues to sit in his meditation. Mara says, I'm going to try temptation. So he sends his daughters. And, the beautiful demonesses, they represent sexual temptation, the pleasures of the flesh, all this kind of stuff. Now, we're told in some of the texts that Siddhartha's father, King Sujata, had a pleasure palace. We're never really explained what is in a pleasure palace, but I can imagine Siddhartha's like, I left the pleasure palace. You think your daughters are going to tempt me? But however that worked out, he was not swayed. So Mara calls on the god of love and says, well, if I can't seduce you with my daughters, maybe I can get you to fall in love with one. So the god of love has a bow that's made out of bees, and he pulls back his arrow to shoot it into Siddhartha's heart, but it falls short. And Siddhartha just continues to sit. Now Mara's really mad. He's like, this is ridiculous. I cannot believe that I, the king of the demons, cannot sway this human. So he gets together a bunch of other demons, and they form this attacking horde, and they go after Siddhartha, and he just continues to sit there because he knows they're not real. So he's not afraid, and he just sits. Darkness falls. At this time in this place, the night is divided into a series of watches where they would have watchmen on the walls and through the town, maybe like we think of modern police, maybe not at all like we think of modern police, I don't really know, but they had watchmen and they divided it into 4 watches. And in the first watch of the night, Siddhartha continued to sit, and he saw suffering arising. He also recognized the watcher in his own mind. Now, those of you who've been meditating for any time at all have experienced the watcher. It's the part of your mind that notices when you're thinking. It's the part that goes, you're daydreaming again, and brings you back to your breath. That's the watcher. The Buddha identified this part of his mind during this first section or watch of the night. He saw the interconnectedness of all things, which he would conceptualize as the 12-link chain of dependent origination. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next, in an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. During the second watch of the night, we're told the night went silent. That would make sense. People have gone to bed by now, and so it's very quiet. And Siddhartha sees the universe as a mirror. And he sees all the beings being born and passing away according to their karma. So he comes to a very full and complete understanding of this law of cause and effect and how it works. He understands causality. At this point, he relinquished the watcher in his mind, and his mind opened further still. So a step beyond that when we notice we're thinking. He passes beyond that. And he turns his mind inward to look at his question. Siddhartha says, when this is present, that comes to be. From the arising of this, that arises. But if this is absent, then that does not come to be. So again, he's seeing cause and effect, and how if you don't have these conditions, this thing can't occur. So he asked himself a question, who is it that senses this? But then he had an insight, and he said there's a deeper question. With what as a condition does sensation occur? So he's taking himself out of his question. It's no longer a personal, who is this I that's sensing, but rather, what are the conditions that cause sensing? So he says, who is it that is reborn? Instead of asking that, what are the conditions that cause birth? So he's starting to develop this idea that he will further amplify later on about non-self or not self. During the third watch of the night, Siddhartha realized that there was a way out of suffering. He understood how dependent arising, the circle we talked about, can be a way out if you go the other direction. and then you can put it all down and stop being reborn. Remember that in ancient India, being reborn was not considered a good thing because there was so much suffering, filth, poverty, disease, war. Life was brutish and short. So having to come back to it was not something that people wanted to do. So having a way out of that pattern was seen as a goal. During the fourth watch, he realized that the way out was what came to be called the Noble Eightfold Path, where he gives us very specific instructions. Live this way, and it helps to reduce your grasping and clinging, and you suffer less. You are less dissatisfied, happier with your life. So he had that revelation in the fourth and final watch of the night. At dawn, he saw all of his past rebirths, and he saw the last trace of ignorance fading away. The first star of the morning came out, and he saw the underlying truth of reality, the way things really are. And through that realization, he had the moment of his liberation, then at dawn, seeing the star. Now we start calling him Buddha, the awakened one. Siddhartha Gautama, depends on who you ask, and I'm tongue-tied. And that's okay, we can still put that on YouTube. So I'm not too proud to be tongue-tied with Sanskrit. So now he's called the Buddha, the awakened one. But he wanders around for about 6 weeks, and he thinks, is anybody going to be able to understand what I'm trying to tell them? Because I've seen the looks that some of you are giving me while I explain this, and you're like, what? And he probably had the same experience. So he's wondering, is this too alien to teach? Is anybody really going to be able to understand this? Should I teach it all? And he's not really sure. And then he's approached by a deva. And a deva is another god, small g, from the Vedic tradition there in India. It's the Deva Samapati. And he asked him to teach in order to save others. Samapati says there will be some people who can understand this teaching, and you can be of tremendous benefit to them. So the Buddha says, all right, and he says, this is just the impetus I've been waiting for. Now that I'm asked to teach, I will go and teach. And this, by the way, is still the tradition of Buddhist teachers, is we teach when we're asked to teach, and we don't go door to door handing out leaflets, right? If there's an invitation, we're happy to oblige. So that goes back to this event. So the Buddha heads to the deer park in Sarnath, and this was a local hangout for yogis and seekers of the time. The kind of the poet's corner, the hip, trendy place, and there were a lot of people there offering teachings. And so that's where he goes, because that's where people come when they are looking for a religious teacher. So who does he run into but his old 5 friends? And they look at him, and one of them comes up to him first and realizes that he's changed. Something is different about him. So he goes and gets the other 4, and they're willing to listen to him because, well, first of all, he's no longer starving and emaciated, but he's also calmer, and he has a peace about him. And you've changed since we saw you. What happened? So they become among the first people that he gives teachings to, and he teaches them the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And then we have the first Buddhist ceremony, which is the refuge ceremony. This is when someone takes refuge in the Buddha, the historical teacher, and all the teachers since, the Dharma, the teachings themselves, and the Sangha, the spiritual community on the path. That was the first ceremony, and one of the Buddha's 5 old friends, who was a Brahmin, became the first to take ordination. Live the holy life in order to completely end suffering. That's the purpose there of the ordination. His 4 other friends eventually joined, and they became the nucleus of what was now called the Sangha. And eventually all 5 of the Buddha's historical friends would attain arhatship, which is different than becoming a Buddha. So next time we'll talk about what is an arhat, is it something to aspire to, and what the Buddha does as he goes out and begins to teach.